Today's episode of Filmmaker U is brought to you by our sponsors OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. And it's also brought to you by our other sponsors, AJA. Make sure to check out aja.com so that you can see how they can help you in your post-production needs. Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com, and of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional, and this week, we're discussing the sound work of sound designer Scott Martin Gershin, whose work includes Pacific Rim, American Beauty, and more recently, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, just to name a few. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Glad to have. Thank you for having me.
I guess I have to ask this because I think every person born in the 70s and 80s would want me to. What was it like working on Transformers and G.I. Joe?
You know, I was a youngin. I was just new to the industry, and I was working for a company that was doing cartoons, and it was fine. You know, in those days it was fast. We had to turn these things around like in a day or two. So, and we didn't really have computers the way we do now. So, it was hard. We would sync sounds up. We would grab tape to tape transfers, use carts. It was just a very different time. I think back of it and it's just exhausting to think about it.
I'm going to interrupt this interview for 1 second. We want to thank PixelView, one of our sponsors. They're a streaming solution for filmmakers. PixelView lets you stream your work to remote clients for easy collaboration, and it works with both on-set teams and post-production teams. With built-in video chat, you can discuss and make changes in real time and stream directly from your editing software. Or you can use the hardware encoder to stream from DaVinci Resolve or the camera on set. See the promo code and the link in the video description below. Well, yeah, it's funny because they're such iconic. Like they're still making Transformers movies now.
Oh, I know. And you know, G.I. Joe was already established. Transformers was semi-new at the time, and we'd have libraries. We built it in, and it was like as fast as assembly as you can. I'd love to say there was a lot of design time, and you know, but in those days, it almost felt like cartoons were more commercials to sell toys.
Well,
I got a light out here, so I apologize.
Yeah, no problem.
Light in effect.
Well, it's interesting that you would say that because when I was doing some research for this, you said in one interview that you like to collect sounds. How big is your library at this point? Because you've been collecting sounds for years.
It's huge. I think I'm over 42 terabytes.
Wow.
And it's just, you know, it's just recording. Some of it's duplicates, I would imagine. But it's pretty big because think of it as an audio photographer.
Yeah.
I'm always constantly recording, or I'm collecting libraries that you could purchase. But a lot of it is stuff that I've just recorded or just worked on or created over the decades I've been doing this.
Now, do you have a particular sound from your recordings that you find is your favorite sound to listen to, or?
There's a lot of sounds. You know, it's interesting is, honestly, as time has gone on and technology has progressed, it's sort of the equivalent to photography is very close. So when you take an old photograph, it was great, but it has a certain look to it. Same thing with older recordings, has a certain sound to it. It doesn't mean that it's a bad recording or I can't use it. It just may not have as much definition and clarity. Sometimes not. I did stuff early on with dry ice on a canoe, and you take dry ice and you play the canoe. It just makes the canoe sing. Oh, any kind of metal. I mean, I did that early on and during Honey Shrunk the Kids. Yeah. You know, and that was a very different technology than what we have now, as far as fidelity. But sometimes the great sound is a great sound, and there's a couple sounds I still use because it's just the right sound.
Interesting.
You know?
Now, I have to ask, you've been referred to as musical in your sound design. What do people mean by that when they say that?
Well, when I edit and when I design, I'm always keeping in mind rhythms and what I call phrasing. So, for instance, I'll just take something as simple as a footstep. So when you take two things, clack, 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 right? So I may go clack, 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 clack. You know, I really try to shape it where the footstep is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Or somebody's leaning, you go for the subtle. I mean, I'm just using that as a metaphor, but everything I do it feels like a musical phrase. Pitch is always big. How is my sound design comparing and playing against music? Sometimes it's consonant, sometimes it's dissonant. I use a lot of sound effects that have tonality to them, especially in design, where I'm trying to create something that doesn't exist in nature, such as in Pinocchio, death. You know, all of a sudden, it has a flow, it has a rhythm, it has a pitch. It's the same thing as a lot of music composers are putting musical sound design in their shows. And whether it's Hans Zimmer going, you know, using them rhythmically, there's sometimes a cross between sound designers on the sound effects sides and musical people on the sound design side. So there's sometimes a cross. I did that a lot, so much so that in some past movies I got music credit, like on Oliver Stone's Heaven and Earth, and just a number of shows, especially the Oliver Stone ones, where I was using gondolas and gongs and metal hits, and I was creating sounds that had emotional impact that had nothing to do with what you saw, especially during the torture sequences.
Well,
so,
sorry. Well, I was going to
say, so you could create sounds that give you an emotional response. It's not literal. What you see is not happening, but now all of a sudden it makes you feel something.
Well, I've also heard that you use your voice to create sounds. Can you take us through that process? Or
yeah, I mean, I think I started out of fear. I was doing the first one I did was Honey Shrunk the Kids. Joe Johnson wanted me to do Auntie, and I'm thinking, okay, it's an ant, it's a crustacean, it's kind of, you know, how does an ant do its thing? Then he said, well, it's a rodeo sequence, he's happy, he's sad, he's got all these emotions, and I had no clue how to do it, so I grabbed the microphone and I vocalized it, which then led into, you know, dozens and dozens of shows that I've been on. I've a lot of the animals in Tarzan's, Disney's Tarzan, Flubber, Herbie, I used my voice. And most people said I didn't know Herbie had a voice. And then I would say, did you find Herbie cute? And they said, yeah. I said, it's a Volkswagen, think about it. So my goal is, if I do things that you wouldn't know that I'm doing it. I'm the voice of the dragon in Shrek, the Reapers and Blade, and in Pinocchio, I used my voice to create Dogfish. You know, how do I get a creature to make sound like he's sneezing or he's going to sneeze? And how do I give it a personality, whether it's an inanimate object, you know, Flubber, I've got goo, CG goo, and now I got to make him cute and sing and do all that kind of stuff. So a lot of times I have done stuff which I call the giggle factor, where I get a little kid to giggle by the goofy sounds that I do, or a leatherback in Pacific Rim is. So what I'll do is I'll grab something. So I don't have it. So I'll grab like tubes and glasses, and I'll go to Home Depot and I buy these long tubes, and I start vocalizing through them to give my voice the feeling of something different. Then I manipulate it through that rack of outboard gear. and then it just becomes something totally different. So it doesn't feel like a voice. I never want my voice to sound like a guy doing a vocal thing. I just want it to be like he's got a vocal quality, or that the animal is expressing emotions through sound, which they don't. Other than dogs, there's no angry, happy, sad. And a lot of times what I do is I'll mimic an animal and then humanize it in regards to not sound like a human, but sounding like it's got emotion.
It's interesting. Now you brought up Pinocchio, so you've worked with Guillermo del Toro several times. So obviously you guys have a good working relationship. So how do you suggest, young people getting into the sound or into film, how do you get into the heads of your director to figure out what they want sound wise? Because you can create a sound out of anything, your voice, like you're saying, so it could go anywhere. So how do you, when you're creating creatures or creating particular sounds, do you get in the head of the director?
Well, okay, first thing is, as a sound artist, you need to have a vocabulary of what you know how to do. And also what I call the inner ear. I always love to watch movies and games and shows, and I'm always watching everything and listening to cool approaches to sound. So now all of a sudden, like a musician, you've heard all the other musicians, you start getting ideas and styles and approaches. The next thing you do, so that gives you your bag of tricks. You understand the technology, you get to the point where you understand the technology well enough that you can grab a plug and you go, I know what that is. The next thing I do is when I'm working with a director I've never met before, I start looking at the other shows. I start looking at their style, what they like, what they don't like. My first early on, when I was in my early 20s starting off, I was working with Oliver Stone, and this kind of formatted the way that I was taught. I went to Oliver, what do you want here? And he said, Scott, if I knew what I wanted, I don't need you. What I need you to do is tell me what I need. And that sort of stuck with me early on. So part of speaking to a new director or a new client, first thing I want to understand, I'm never going to ask them what they want, because it's the wrong question. Because asking somebody what you want, they're not a professional in what you do. So whether it's visuals or audio, they're like, I don't have the expertise that you have. So what the first thing I do is, after understanding their style and their approach and how they would like to work, so I do a lot of listening, the next thing I do is, what don't you want? So when I was working with Guillermo on Pacific Rim, that was the question. He said, I don't want to sound like Transformers. He goes, I want it to make it sound like battleships or duking it out. Like if you were grabbing a battleship and you rejiggered it into a robot, what would that sound like? So then at that point, I will run with it using my imagination and kind of come up with ideas, and little by little pass those ideas to the client. So in the case of Pinocchio, when we looked at Dogfish, we sort of knew what to do because we'd done it before in regards to make something big, really cool, and that went pretty fast for us. In regards to Pinocchio, that was what was really hard. We originally said maybe using vintage puppets. We started with it. We noticed that vintage puppets had a certain hardwood clackiness to it. So after going after the obvious, we realized that may not be the best approach. So at that point, I started looking at other alternatives, other woods. I started contacting a company called PRS Guitars, and they gave me scraps of wood they weren't using. They gave me 50 pounds, which was quite nice. I used that a little bit because it was very tonal, so I had to use it strategically. And myself, and I had a Foley artist, Don O'Connell, and we started putting together ideas. You put together wood, but then Geppetto's walking with wood clogs, and Pinocchio's got wood, and some of the other puppets have wood, and this is a lot of wood. And then you realize it's sort of a one note approach. Once I started seeing what Pinocchio was starting to look like, I started seeing the nails, and I said, "Ooh, maybe it can squeak and creak." Using rubber, using metal. You're having to find the right kinds of squeaky metal to be able to um, bring out different emotions from the character. Because just putting a sound, you've got to find the right sound to emote whatever the emotion is at that time, such as when Pinocchio was in the closet and he was like kind of apologizing. He does this like little hand things like, so it had to feel vulnerable and delicate, which is really weird. You go, hinge sounds vulnerable and delicate, but these are the things you start learning. How does the sound make me feel? Little by little, and then not only that, but within Pinocchio, we had to evolve the character. So I had to show fragility. When he first got created, it's almost a Frankenstein moment. Geppetto in a drunken depression creates an image of his son, kind of dark. So there's a darkness to that. And then as he first comes into being, he has a fragility. So I was using all these little creaks, and when he moved his hands and joints, I cracked walnuts. So you hear the joints cracking into place. I wanted to create Pinocchio at the very beginning as as sort of a creature. But like any creature, as you started getting to know Pinocchio, I start changing the way his sound is being used to less focus on him being a wooden, squeaky creature into this lovable character. And so the whole sound of Pinocchio evolves through the whole show. And Pinocchio is pretty much made up of about 8 different elements. But you don't hear it as 8 different elements. You just hear it as one performance.
So, what would you say in Pinocchio was one of the tougher scenes or tougher sounds to sort of figure out and create?
I think, when we first started, because this is stop motion, it's not like you get the whole picture and you just do it. We were doing it not even scene by scene, but shot by shot. So I would get like a 3-second shot. That's it. And then, 20 seconds of storyboards. And I would get another 5-second shot. And this happened over 14 months. We even went to the mix without everything there. And so little by little, it was a constant upgrade, evolving, iterating, because you started getting the library, but then you needed to have the rhythm or the phrase. So if he's walking, it's like dick 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 duck. But all I would do is have dick dick, and then I'd wait another month and get dick dick dick, and then I'd go another month and I go dick 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 dick. So to do the whole phrase sometimes took 6 months. So constantly you was a puzzle. You put it together, you set it aside. You put it together, you set it aside, and then near the end you start phrasing it like I don't want to do it, to make it short. So you hear the locking of the metal as he's being belligerent. So it was never a linear process. It was very music concrete almost, where it was patchworky at the beginning, and only near the last couple months did it start formulating and coming together. And then it's sort of like, I would consider this the audio version of sculpting. You've got a block. You start building a rough face, and then you start building the details, and little by little. So over time, you keep refining it and getting more detail. And as I was seeing the visuals just being amazing and really trying to match the detail, I did the same thing. I kept refining it, adding a little this, adding a little that, adding a little cloth, adding something that gave that character depth of field, and a more complex and humanistic approach to it rather than just a simple sound. There's a lot went into it. Also, if you look at the film, and especially watch it in the theater, we start in mono and we end in Atmos. So we wanted the mix itself, which is really unusual in film, to evolve, because Guillermo wanted to have it as a puppet show at the very beginning and make it feel very intimate. And then little by little, as we start evolving into the show and we start getting into the performances and re-education camp and then into the dogfish, now all of a sudden we're using all the cool technologies to make it much more immersive. But at the beginning, we didn't want to do that. And at the very end, we go back to mono.
That sounds awesome. How the heck do you get, because you talked about the mix there, but you also mentioned a little earlier that you went to the mix and weren't finished in a sense, or everything wasn't in place.
Which is not uncommon, by the way.
Yeah. But how do you prepare for that? Because you don't want to, get ready for the show and not be missing a bunch of sounds or missing things.
Yeah. So I do a lot of work with CG and complex graphics. So I kind of go into shows that way. So because I have so much experience, it doesn't faze me that much. I just know how to attack it and how to solve the problem through it. I ended up working with John Taylor and Frankie Matania, who are just fantastic. And I've been in battle with them, as we sometimes refer to it. So I say, this is done, this is good, this is soft, because they keep changing sync a little bit. And we keep iterating it, changing it also. So the design was changing and evolving even during the mix. So I didn't go to the mix with everything done. Some scenes were really close. Other scenes were not actually done. So you use with what you have. And again, it's like sculpting, you massage it, you put it in, that's good. Now let's work on the arm, let's work on the hand, let's work on the different parts of the character. And it's the same thing with the story. Or, the splats music, again, fantastic. So we'll listen to that and I'll go, oh, he's using instrumentation like this, which was different than what I anticipated. So because of that, I'm going to change it all up. So it was me. I had a team of other editors. It was great. I had Chris Richardson, Andrew Vernon, Dan Gamache, and Tomi, and Tomi Tomita. And little by little, I would sit there and say, wait a minute, this has changed. Let's redo it. Or I'd call Dan on the Foley stage and say, I'm going to change direction now. I want to go left instead of right. So I was constantly iterating on the sound until the day after we finished the mix.
Wow.
We had one section where Guillermo wanted one of the characters, Volpe, at certain times to have tap shoes. And we did the tap dancing and he's like, no, it's not right. So I figured first I did toes. Then he said, no, it's not right. So I did heel toe, tick, tick, where it's like tick, 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 tick. Then it's tick, 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 tick. And that didn't work. Then we just, for some reason, weren't connecting. Out of the whole show, that was our biggest, it's not right. And I brought Dancer in, I did all that. And then finally, he showed me a video on the last day of the mix, which was like a 1930s guy tap dancing up and down the stairs. And I said, he goes, that's what I like. And I said, but our sync is different. He goes, I don't care about sync. I said, you didn't say that. So what was great was our music editor, his daughter was going to be going to Juilliard as a dancer. So we quickly grabbed her, recorded her on wooden stairs, got this recording, edited it in so it starts in sync, it ends in sync, and in the middle is a little soft, but you got a rhythm down. And I dragged him back in. They said, no, he's not available anymore. And I'm like, yeah. I contacted Guillermo directly and I said, you got to hear this. He came down, he said, exactly. That's exactly what I wanted. We did it. Took us 15 minutes. We did the other scenes. The whole point is never give up. You got to keep working it to figure out what am I missing. I told my crew when we first started, we would be doing that. We'd just be, I said, you might think you're done, but I might change things up again. So.
Now I have to ask, one of my favorite things when talking to sound people is that you have to communicate sounds that we don't have to play. So like people will be like, and then it sounded like this. Woo. Something weird like that. What's the weirdest sound you've had to communicate to a director without being able to show them the sound or
So
play it?
part of what my who I am and what I do is I vocalize a lot. So, and the way I got Flubber was I was working with John Hughes, and I'm trying to go, do you like it like, like what do you? So I start vocalizing this whole thing. He thinks I'm crazy. So I'm looking at it. Do you like this? Do you like that? And I'm just doing it through vocals. And so it gave me an idea because there's no words to describe elasticity other than just doing it. So I did it. He really liked it. So he gave me a direction. And then about a week later, he said, hey, I need Flubber done on Friday for this one, for some reason. So I said, I still don't know what Flubber's going to sound like. I'm still figuring it out. It was early on. And he goes, you know what you did in my office, all that vocal stuff? Do that. So I did it, sent it to him, put it in the cutting room. Came back later, and I said, so we got to figure out Flubber. We haven't figured it. He goes, no, you're Flubber. He goes, just, I want to tweak it a little more, and I want to do some more vocals, but I love what you did. You're going to do that.
Now, did you get a top billing credit above Robin Williams?
Yeah, there you go. No.
Movie's named after your character.
I know. But I think I did get the Flubber credit.
Yeah.
John got me into SAG. And since then, I've done a lot of stuff. And sometimes a lot of stuff that I specialize is non-language characters. I keep getting asked to create emotions off of existing characters. And I don't know, I just seem to have a good feel for it. So it's one of my specialties. Take something that has no it's just a piece of something, piece of wood, a piece of creature, a piece of goo, and now make it funny, make it sad, make it happy, do all those things. So it seems to be that people like what I've done, and I've done a bunch of it. So that's kind of how I get. I mean, I've done, just to be honest, out of pure fear, because I don't know how else to do it. Someone says do that, I'm like, oh, okay. And then I start do something, they love that. And I've been able to perfect it and evolve the techniques to make sure it doesn't sound like the same thing either.
Now, I have one last question for you. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch?
I like all sorts of shows. I like, the deep dramas. And then, I like everything from Supernatural, which is kind of fun and goofy. I thought it was well done, to Buffy, in the days when it came out, to Game of Thrones. I mean, there's so much I like. I like it well written. And so I do watch quite a bit of TV, actually, because it's so good right now. I mean, there's so many creatively good shows that you can take something that might be campy and make it strangely really good. So it doesn't have to be dramatic and hard hitting, but can be light and fun. So yeah, some of that stuff.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And that's it for this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com, or of course on Twitter at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.
Today's episode of Filmmaker U is brought to you by our sponsors OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. And it's also brought to you by our other sponsors, AJA. Make sure to check out aja.com so that you can see how they can help you in your post-production needs.